So yeah, welcome to this event, to our teaching event. And I'm just going to ask everyone another question. So tell us, are you interested today in becoming a primary teacher, secondary, special needs, head or a deputy head, or some other kind of teacher? Because there are so many options out there. And yeah, there's no wrong answers. You can select all of them if you're interested in all of them. See what everyone's interests are. So
if you're a uni student, you're not sure what route you're taking. I know when I was applying, I applied for both primary and secondary because I'd worked with kind of both before, so I was okay to go. But I think secondary won out in the end just because they're a little bit older, and I get to be a bit more specific with it.
Mm-hmm. And actually, do people ever change do people ever go a few years secondary and then switch over? Not so much.
I've never heard of it, but I think it's because I'm an NQT, so I haven't made like a massive connection of teacher friends yet.
In my experiences with ARC, we're doing some people have come from primary and secondary, and we've also got some people next year who've trained in, for example, Australia, and they're coming back over here and training in primary, having been doing secondary out in Oz. So it does happen sometimes. It is reasonably rare.
Nice one. And what we can see here, we've got a kind of heavy lean towards secondary teaching interest from our uni students. And then, yeah, a few interested in primary, special needs, SLT, senior leadership team. And some people have a few other things in mind as well. So yeah, let's kick off. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you so much everyone for coming. So we've got this kind of 2-week program of careers events. We know that there have been like far fewer opportunities less opportunities to visit schools, get work experience, get an idea, just going to get kind of like physical experience to get an idea of how to plan your next steps after school or uni. So we've put on all these events to help so you can like hear the experiences of these different professionals and just get a better sense of how to plan your next steps and kind of what will suit you in the future as well. So let me introduce our lovely panel. So we've got Mark Naylor here, who is a former deputy head and he's now a teacher trainer with the ARC Academy Trust. And we've got Hannah Oram here, who is she's an art, graphics and RS teacher. So a triple threat at a secondary school. We've got Ella Camplin here, who's an assistant head of a primary school in central London and also a special educational needs coordinator, also known as a SENCO. We've got Christy Waddle here, who's also an art secondary teacher. I should say as well, so Christy, you're still qualifying as teacher, and then Hannah has been qualified for a couple of years. And then Mark and Ella are obviously old hats, they rule the school. Nice one. Do you want to just give a bit more information about yourself? Do you want to just introduce yourself a little bit? So Mark, go for it.
Yeah, hi. I've been teaching or in education now for about 16 years. My primary subject was English and media, and I've done a number of roles within schools. So I've been head of faculty, assistant head, deputy head, and I've made a move into teacher training about a year ago.
Nice one. And I should add as well, how about the rest of you tell us, and I'll ask you as well, Mark, like what made you want to be a teacher when you started out?
Interesting one to start with, Mariota. I never wanted to be a teacher initially. Both my parents are teachers and 2 of my aunts were teachers, so I said I'm never doing that. And then I went travelling when I was about 22. I'd done sales and recruitment before that, and I ended up working for about a week with an organisation in Vietnam that teach English to orphans to try and keep them off the streets as starting to give them some skills. And I enjoyed that. And then on my return, a friend of mine who just trained to teach said he thought I'd be good and I should come and observe what he did. So I went and observed him at his school for a week and really loved the engagement with the students, and the rest is history.
So you got the bug for it.
I did, exactly.
And Hannah, tell us about yourself and what made you want to be a teacher.
I always wanted to be a teacher, actually, since I was really young, just because I had some teachers that were really influential and encouraged me in my further education, which in a way maybe that my family didn't. So yeah.
And Ella, how about you?
Hello. I have been in education for about 14 years. I did Italian and music at university, which were just subjects that I wanted to do because I enjoyed languages and music at school and didn't know what I wanted to do at that point. So I did something fun at university and then thought I might want to go into journalism or marketing because that just seemed to be what everybody I knew did at that point. And I went to a big kind of careers fair, I guess, like this, but in person, and sort of wandering around and stumbled across a teacher training stall and ended up standing there for about an hour and a half talking to somebody and getting incredibly passionate about that. So decided that's what I wanted to do. And then I applied for my PGCE at the Institute of Education, and in the year sort of between university and starting that, I worked in a special school, which wasn't necessarily where I wanted to end up, but I applied for a few different places for a year course as a sort of a TA, and got that, and I absolutely loved it. It was amazing. And then started as an NQT after my PGCE in the school I'm still at. So I've been at the same school for quite some time and have worked my way through various roles. And yeah, I became Senko and assistant head about 3 years into my time there. So earlier than I probably would have anticipated if I'd actually thought about it in advance. But you know, these chances and opportunities came up. And I think it's quite important to say yes to things. And so, yeah, so that's where I still am.
Next one. And Christy.
So I grew up in the Caribbean, and when I came here, the high school environment was so different. So it was like a massive culture shock to me. So I kind of became a little bit more interested in it. I came when I was like just getting into year 11. So it was absolutely crazy to me, like how the schools were, like you would leave class, and I thought that was so cool. It was so like something you'd seen on TV in the Caribbean. And when I got here, it was so like the way how I was taught like English and art specifically, I just thought it was so much more like inspiring to actually be told like these subjects are important as well, you know. Like you always get like STEM, but art specifically, people are always like, oh, like it's just a bit of a silly subject, you know. It's not that good. But in reality, like art is the reason why I'm here. It's the reason why I'm speaking today. I went to uni, I studied art. I volunteered at my sister's, like at my local high schools to teach art. And then I went back to like NCS. I've done British Study Centres, all of it because I just love working with young people and kids and teaching art. And I just think it's such a good way kind of for kids to have a subject that sometimes people might think one way about, but I like kind of twisting that around and being like, oh miss, like I'm so excited to see you, or oh miss, like this is such a good subject, you know, and having like, changing those conceptions. I think that's why I got into it, to change the conception of art, I think.
Wonderful. But also I studied art at uni as well, so I would have loved to be your student. But I remember at school people often thought art was a sky subject. What do you say when kids say that to you in class? If they do.
I always say art is actually, well, coming from art, I honestly think it's one of the hardest subjects because there's no such thing as being finished in art. There's no such thing. Like if you finished your one drawing, okay, you have to now go and do your research around it. If you finish that, then you've got to do your annotations. When you finish that, then you have to do your transcriptions. Like it's not something that is really easy just because you associate it with drawing. There's so much writing, like the literacy aspect of art is so important. There's like math involved, you have to know, and I even struggle with it sometimes, like the grid method and proportions and things like that. like rule of three. All of these things are so important in art, and I just explain it to them in that kind of way. I'm always like, well, you might think that, but let's have a go at it then, and we'll see, you know.
Most important thing. And so I guess a question for all of you actually, like, how did you decide the specific path that you ended up going down? So it sounds like, Christy, you kind of like, if I'm right, like art was the starting point for you, and you kind of like wanted to share that passion. Did you ever think of being like a primary art teacher, or like kind of any other type of educator?
Yeah, I really enjoyed, so I worked for the Challenge, I think it's called now, as an art practitioner for a few years as well, like during summer before I was teaching. And I think as I was doing that in the summer, I was really open to the whole like going into schools and doing like workshops, and it's something that I'm still like interested in. But I think the reason why I chose teaching in general is because you get to build those relationships that you wouldn't necessarily be able to build if you went in just more of a workshop role, you know. And in terms of secondary, I think I just probably chose it because I think maybe that I just like I'm younger as well, and I think I was closest to that age, so I felt like I could almost relate to them at that stage of their life, the like sixth formers, and I'd be like, you know, like I get what you're going through. I was here like a very short time ago, and I just wanted to be like a role model in a way. I think that's why I chose secondary.
Interesting. And it's like, how about for you, Ella? Like, how did you choose, sort of when you thought you wanted to be a teacher, how did you choose first primary and then also special needs within that?
So I always just found it fascinating, the sort of thought of how you actually teach a young child to read and spell and get all those kind of foundation blocks of their learning. I just found that incredibly interesting, and probably also slightly, I'm quite short, I'm 5'2", and the thought of going into a secondary school and having 16-year-olds towering over me was completely terrifying. So I think probably opposite to Christy, I kind of felt like I still felt really young and like I'd only just finished secondary school really. And the thought of going into a secondary school and trying to teach them anything about anything was just ridiculous. So primary school seemed to be the place. I adored school, both primary and secondary. I think I was very lucky. I went to really lovely schools, including quite a small secondary school in London. So I think I always felt very nurtured in both schools, and had lovely teachers and very good experiences at school. So that kind of really gave me a strong kind of basis of what I knew I wanted to emulate. And the SEN thing, my brother is very dyslexic and had a really tough time at school. And I suppose I had a little bit of a feeling of kind of always wanting to fight his corner and hope that children wouldn't have to go through that. He had, you know, he had a really difficult time and had some quite ununderstanding teachers. This was in the 80s. I don't think schools necessarily are like that anymore. But I think, I always felt a bit soapboxy, and like I wanted to kind of make sure children didn't have those experiences, and that I wanted to help create a really inclusive environment in a mainstream school, because all children should be able to access that. And as I said before, the opportunity kind of came up, I think, earlier than I would have potentially liked it to have done, really, but somebody went on maternity leave. And I was asked to cover it, so I did, and I loved it, and kind of went from there, really. But yeah, just I think having a really good experience at school myself, I think, really helped.
Yeah. And how about you, Mark? Like, how did you know that secondary teaching? How can, other than deciding by height or by I did, like, how much you enjoyed school? Like, what do you think makes like a really good secondary teacher versus a primary teacher, and how would you say those are? Would you say they're different skills?
I think mostly skills are transferable. Like if you can teach well at primary, you can teach well at secondary. A lot of the skills you will use that are the same. Secondary students are just big kids, even A-level students. most of the time you use the same tactics you'd use with the year 7 class, and in some ways they buy into loads of the things you try with the year 7 class better than the year 7 class do. And I mean, in terms of the route I chose, the orphanage work was with like younger children, and I found that difficult in the sense of obviously it was teaching English, and my speciality was literature rather than language, and I think what swung it was going into a secondary school and actually the relationships that you could build with the students, and essentially the kids are really funny. They make me laugh every single day, and therefore that made me go, do you know what, actually secondary, I feel there could be some good relationships there. I hate the word, but some good banter there as well. And yeah, and English was my subject, and I felt I wanted to impart more of my subject as a speciality to those students, too. And I went to having done my undergraduate degree, I had a couple of years out or so, and then I went to King's College in London, and I had to do brush up on subject knowledge because I'd done a joint degree in English and film. I'd missed certain English units that they want you to have studied, so I had to produce portfolio during my PGCE to show what I thought of texts or they'd set me to read, and yeah, it was a really, really good choice.
Nice one. So I guess you just kind of have like a bit of a gut feel, like you've got a kind of lot of rational sort of like decision making points, but I guess like you just had a gut feeling of what would be best for you.
I think there was sort of one thing that swayed it. Was I had to do a primary school experience before I went, and the chairs are just so small I couldn't deal with sitting in those all day, so it had to be secondary, really.
Right, so your own height and size of chair, we're not saying those are the main things, but whatever. but neither of you have regretted your decisions. So, how about you, Hannah? Like, what made you think secondary that you would be best at secondary?
That's a good question. I think for me, one of the main reasons why I went into teaching, I am very passionate about my subject. I love art, but it's always kind of secondary for me. For what I wanted to do when I went into teaching was to kind of promote wider education and all the things that aren't on the curriculum. I love kind of opening philosophical discussion, politics, just kind of encouraging free and like higher thinking amongst the students. And I think that art is a particularly good space to do that, as opposed to core subjects, which as a primary school teacher you have to cover everything, and it's incredibly essential and an ethical thing that you have to. It's harder to digress, I think, when you're teaching a primary school curriculum. So I wanted to have one subject. I wanted to have art because it is such an open space. Feels more autonomous as a teacher leading it and as a student partaking in it. And I think one of my main passions is kind of like, I guess, discovering or like helping a student realize their potential. I love giving unsolicited careers advice.
The best kind of advice.
Sorry?
The best kind of advice, unsolicited.
Yeah, exactly. I think students are mature enough to realize their teachers are human beings and they can either take their advice or not. But I think I like to kind of see something in someone, and it's a lot easier when they're a little bit older and more. You can see their personality forming a bit better.
So, and because you've taught art and English, and is this RS and graphics, so it's quite interesting for anyone thinking of being a secondary teacher, because you might think you've got to make your decision, like I'm going to be an English teacher, but like what was that kind of like, what are the possibilities there, like how much, like when do you have to make a decision, if you ever do?
So when you train for secondary, I mean, Mark probably knows more about this, but you pick your subject is my awareness of it. And if you have, so for example, the first job I got teaching art and RS was because I needed to make up something in the timetable. And often, if you are a soft subject teacher, they will just bung something else in your timetable. So that's why I got RS. I was completely happy to do that because I love RS, and I love religious awareness. I think it's a really important part of creating a healthy society. Um, but that's something you should be aware of if you are going to pick a subject that is kind of less in demand. You can't be utopian about it. You have to be realistic and think, actually, I need to be versatile and open to teaching DT, whatever it is, alongside your subject.
Do you mind if I just jump in as well, Hannah? There's you will start out choosing a subject generally. If you're going into secondary teaching, it might be that sometimes you've got a secondary discipline. So I could teach media as well as English. When I started, I was actually given the job as an English and drama teacher, which was a bit of a baptism of fire as a drama teacher. But you may have areas of interest. So if you've got A levels that are strong, schools may well look at those, and if you're interested and willing and they don't have certain subjects, they may look at you to try and set up departments as well. But yeah, Hannah's right. If there are areas where there are shortages, they may well ask people who have strong A levels in certain areas or interests in certain areas if they'd be willing to teach those. And you also sometimes find in secondaries, as certain people get older, they try and maybe add some more strings to their bow in terms of the types of subject they might teach as well. So you sometimes find PE teachers moving into who have strong math skills, moving into maths and science teaching as an addition to their timetable too.
Interesting. And on that note, I'm interested in kind of both from like Mark and Ella. What was the transition like going from just a classroom teacher to to a member of the senior leadership team? And I don't know, did you enjoy it? Like, how would you recommend or not going into the SLT of the school rather than doing versus doing all classroom teaching? How about Ella? You take it first.
I think certainly in primary school, most teachers would work their way through the M levels of the teaching sort of salary pay scale. So they do usually 5 or 6 years of classroom teaching, and then you would go through threshold, and you might have other things that you would take on. So during that time, you might become a middle leader. So you'd lead on other subjects and support your colleagues with other subject teaching. And then you may be given or asked to lead a core subject and become sort of a little bit more important, I suppose, in the structure of the school. So you might be asked to lead English or maths or something that the school is sort of working on to improve the school. And at that point, it depends on the size of the school, but some schools will have a senior leadership team of sort of 2 or 3 people, members of staff. Others will have kind of 10. It really depends on the size of the school and also what their kind of priorities are in terms of their improvements and where they're going. And you know, it kind of, it very much depends school on school, but usually you kind of work through a bit of the structure of the school depending on where you start. And you might kind of then jump to a different role if you move schools. And yeah, I think a lot of the time in schools it's about circumstance and being in the right place at the right time, but also about being open to new challenges and opportunities, and kind of saying yes when things come your way.
Yeah, I think to follow on what Ella said as well, the difference, I think one of the things to be aware is, as a classroom teacher, you have a lot of contact with the students. Depending on your level of seniority, you may end up, so I ended up moving from like a head of faculty for English. So I had about 3/4 timetable. But then by the time I was a deputy head, I had 1 year 11 English class. So that means that actually what you make the transition to doing, at least in secondary school, is dealing a lot with staff, wider school issues, and you will have areas of responsibility depending both on your skill set, but also on school need, that you will focus on. So for example, I've been in charge of assessment and reporting, so looking at exams, looking at how parents receive that information, looking at student progress, teaching and learning, so what they're teaching, the quality of the teaching in the classroom, and it is challenging, but it is enjoyable. You know, you get the opportunity to try a lot of things, and it may well, I had the opportunity, I was moved around, I think about 3 times during my time in SLT, to pick up areas where they needed maybe more support in, and that was put me out of my comfort zone at times, and that meant sometimes a steep learning curve. But the opportunities I've had since, and the jobs and things I could be open to now, are often because of those experiences. And yeah, you have multiple skills as a consequence of it, and you don't lose the teaching, you just do a little bit less of it, which is sometimes unfortunate, but it does, you know, both the time and pay increases help that a little bit as well.
How about you, Christy, and like your subject, like, do you want to be ahead, or like what do you think when you kind of look forward in your career?
At the moment, I think I'm aiming for my QTS before everything, and then I'd rather personally at the minute, I'd rather just kind of get as much experience as possible. I'm one of those people where I really need to get my head around it, I have to just be in it, like immersed in it, which is why I think like online teaching has been like a challenge for me sometimes. Hopefully I would love to be like head of department one day. I think it would be an amazing challenge to like take on. I love teaching, so I think it's something that I would look into. I did have a question there, and I'm not sure if anyone's asked it in the Q&A, and I know Ella, Mark and Hannah were like talking about being very like cross-curricular and like diverse in like their styles of teaching and the way how they've like moved up. And I just thought some people might wonder, is there like training provided for like the subjects, or like when you're moving on to like, for example, like assistant head, etc., like is there training provided for it? Or for like Hannah especially, you've taught so many subjects, were you given just like a curriculum, or did you have like training in it, if that makes sense?
For like RS and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I wasn't trained at all. I felt I did actually ask for an observation once because I was so worried that I wasn't doing a good job, but it was fine. So no.
I think that's something to.
I guess Mark, feel like you're best placed to answer that.
I think it depends on the experience you have in the school you're at. So you take a trust like ARC, and because they're so large, they have online training systems, and they have in-school training systems, and then centralized training that you can be part of. So you can have the training required to be a middle leader or a senior leader. In some schools, you don't get that opportunity. And there are external organisations that run training as well that you can go on, and boroughs may well run the training too. It really depends on the school you end up at. And for example, when I set up my media department, it was about me going off and doing the research, and then speaking to other schools who had it, and said, right, I want to mimic what you do. What does good look like? But there wasn't the same amount of support at that point in time as I think there may well be now. But yeah, it really does depend on the school you end up at, and the network it's within or not as well.
And on that Yeah, thanks for the panel question. On that note, perhaps like Mark, you could kick us off with, so like there are so many different ways to become a teacher. There's, well, and I don't really know all of them, but I know there's PGCE, I know there's Teach First, there's the ARC training, which you could talk a bit more about, and like all the sorts of different sorts of degrees you can do. If you're like in like the end of school or the end of uni, how do you decide what the best route into teaching is for you?
I went through the PGCE route, so I was with King's College, and that experience is you get 2 school placements and you gradually build your time up, from say 3 days a week in school to the end of the year. You're there 5 days a week. You spend 2 days in university. I mean, if I talk you through, I'm happy to talk through the recruitment process for ARC as well. But essentially, ARC is an in-school training. There's schools around the southeast, south coast. So we've got London, Hastings, Portsmouth, and Birmingham. And essentially, you apply, you go to the website, you fill out an application form. It takes about 15 minutes, and they check your eligibility, and then you're sent judgments, or what's called a situational assessment judgment. So it's common sense for teaching. So you can see some of the questions that are on the link that I know you'll send out later, Mariota. But it might say something like, Abdul's got his head on the desk when you arrive in a lesson. It looks like he's been crying. Do you A, shout at him and make him cry some more in front of the class? B, talk loudly at him from the front of the room to see if he's okay in front of everyone? C, start the lesson and get students working, and then go and talk to him quietly about what's going on. It's to see whether you would have the common sense in the classroom. They would then also get you to do a multiple choice quiz on your subject specialism, but it's like a coffee break quiz, because bear in mind, if you're going into like science, you might be a specialist in physics, but you would be expected to teach all 3 sciences. So it's not going to be the hardest science questions going. Then round 1 would be a virtual assessment, which is an interview and a really short presentation with the recruitment team. And round 2 is a school-based assessment, which is based upon communication skills, resilience, ability to take feedback, and whether your beliefs tie in with the recruitment process within, or what ARC believe in. That would include someone from the recruitment team, someone like myself, who is a teaching and learning specialist, and then a principal or a head teacher from one of the regions. And if you're offered that, you then go in and go to your school and meet your principal, and you'd have some in-school orientation before you started in the August. But when you start teaching at ARC, beforehand you have a summer school for 2 weeks where they teach you an intense course on behaviour management particularly. And you'll have contact with your departments, and then the support you get, I think, is really strong, particularly if I compare it to, say, my own experience. So you have a coach in school who meets you weekly, and they focus you on one area to develop each week rather than multiple points. They will either coach you in after school sessions, using video recordings of yourself, which sometimes is a bit embarrassing to begin with, but is fine. You get used to it. Or real-time coaching, which is quite interesting. So they might be stood at the back of the room, you're stood at the front, and they would operate using hand signals, which you'll know in advance, in order to teach you in the moment about how to improve what's going on in the classroom. You'll then have someone like me who's attached to you. So I'm a secondary tutor, and I essentially come and see you every 2 to 3 weeks. I do, one-to-one coaching, but also I'll meet with the trainees, and I might be discussing your general teaching with you, but I also might be discussing your health and welfare. Today, I've been helping someone to get the right paperwork to make sure their mortgage application goes through, and they needed certain information off ARC. So, and within that, I then also teach professional studies, so general teaching and subject studies. So for me, for English. Now with ARC, that's a mix of recorded and face-to-face sessions. We're going actually mainly recorded because of the success of it over the last 2 years, but it will meet half-termly face-to-face. and basically, yeah, the reason I've been impressed with ARC since I joined is it makes a difference in schools in areas where children and families have less opportunities. So there's normally quite a high rate of disadvantaged families, to use the education parlance. And I think because of the small development steps, you can rapidly become a really good teacher, because you master small moments incrementally, but you're doing it week to week. So you're just building upon the next thing. And just to leave 2 points on that, because I realise I've been talking for a bit about the recruitment process, but with ARC you can influence where you go. So we try and place you in schools that are commutable for you within a region, so you can have an experience that's more impactful for you. Sometimes other providers send you where they want you to go rather than where you potentially would like to go. But my advice on it is, if you are genuinely thinking of joining teaching, and whether that's with ARC or any other route, is I would be looking to applying now, because places will be filling up. But with ARCs, for example, you could apply today and be hired by the end of the March and have a job by September that you knew you were going to. But I will stop talking now. Apologies.
That's great. And from the kind of the primary perspective, Ella, like how would you say? So I think you said before that you did a PGCE. Have people in your teachers in your school come through the Teach First program as well? I'm interested how you've kind of compared your own training experience to people who have done the training on the jobs programs.
I did a PGCE, and I think probably most of our teachers did a PGCE. We actually do have a couple of teachers who have come through our school who were TAs, and I was just having a look on the chat and the Q&A thing, asking whether people need to have done a degree. Not necessarily. So we have 2 teachers, one who came through from being a TA just for quite a long time, and she kind of just built up her practice and her experience, and then we supported her doing her PGCE, so she kind of did it that way. And we also have a person, she's from Spain originally, but she came over, she had a degree but not in teaching, from Spain, and she came over because she wanted to volunteer just to improve her English. And she was incredible, and she just worked really, really hard, and kind of again said yes to lots of opportunities. So she started just as an unpaid volunteer, and then became a TA, and was part-time, and did some Spanish teaching, and then has become a teacher kind of through her experience. And it's taken a while, but she's there, and she's absolutely incredible. So I think it is a bit of a mix, but predominantly we see in my school people who've done a PGCE or a BA in education, but it's certainly, I think, not the be all and end all. You don't have to have done that route at all.
Right, and it's like Christy, you're kind of much earlier in your career. What's your training process been like?
So I went to IOE. I applied, Institute of Education. So I went to UCL, Institute of Education. I did the art secondary PGCE. I did it through the school direct route. So I applied to a few schools. I think I said before, I applied to both primary and secondary, but I was hoping for the secondary one. And I got through at St. Bond's, which is where I work now. And I thought it was going to be me going in every day to the school. So when I was told like I had to go for like my second stage one at UCL, I was a bit like, oh, okay. So then I was like, what's going to happen now when I got into it? So I thought it would be different almost. So for me, my school direct and PGCE, they were combined, but I was basically a PGCE student the whole time, which I think there's like this conception sometimes that if you're school direct, you can just be straight into the school and that's it. But I was unpaid, and I went through UCL, and I was at uni. It was literally almost the exact same, apart from the fact that I was interviewed by the school first. So I think sometimes there's a misconception about it, and I myself thought they would be a bit different, but I'm so glad it happened, because if it wasn't for going into UCL, I wouldn't have been able to use like their resources, which are really good. And also I got my placements were sorted a lot earlier, I think, because they were in the diocese. So your placements are chosen not by UCL, they're chosen by your school, your hiring school, if that's the correct word to use. And I think that's it. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I mean, someone in the chat has asked here, Georgia has asked, for the school direct route, how do you apply? Is it through the school's website? I feel like you answered that a bit just now, but.
Yeah, so the way how I applied was I went on to, there's a government website that shows you all the schools that you can apply to. I don't think I applied directly through the schools. I think I applied, I'm not sure how it was now. I think you just use like a portal. Like once you go onto it and you find the schools that are doing it, you click on the portal, you can see how they're doing it. So school direct, or because I think if you apply it for your PGC route, then you apply directly through your uni and UCAS, whereas I applied through the government website through a portal, and then I applied through UCAS. And that's how I did it.
Right, nice one. Well, grab the link off you and share it with everyone in the email after this event. So we'll share a bunch of any of the links which have been mentioned tonight. We'll share out with you afterwards. And Hannah, was your training process the same, or how did you, like, because you could have done, I just feel like you could have done Teach First, you could have done PGC. Like, how did you choose what was best for you at that time?
I actually had quite. I tried to apply independently to some schools, because some schools offer independent training programs, and I'm not just talking about private schools. I applied to a state school who were offering to pay me a real teacher salary, which is really, really rare, because often you'll get paid significantly less than a normal teacher, and they were offering to train me at the same time with a reduced timetable. So I do recommend that you do look on school websites in your local area, and especially if you have links to that school, like perhaps you were an ex-student there, then speak to that school, speak to people you know there, because you can get a really good deal. If you can get paid for your training placement, then there's no better way to do it, in my opinion. The reason I passed that down was because they asked me to train as an English teacher, and I wanted to be an art teacher, and if you do train in a subject, it's likely that you will stay in that subject, especially Key Stage 3 is more transferable, but in terms of teaching at A level, which is what I wanted to teach, it's very unlikely that you'll be able to switch to a different subject.
Yeah, nice one. Would any of you have anything to add on, like, how you choose either kind of resources to go to, or like how you choose what's best for you out of everything that's out there?
One thing I'd suggest is that there are things like bursaries available for STEM subjects. There are, you can get a salaried route through schools. So you are, in many times, you're paid unqualified teacher status, but as soon as then you pass QTS and become a qualified teacher, you then would get qualified teacher pay status. So you'd be on what's known as M1. And there are multiple different routes in now. So I think with obviously people being aware of things like both the finance, but also the quality of the training you are going to receive, it is going to be key, because some places may well offer you to train with them, but may not necessarily have stronger systems, and you might find that actually you're doing you aren't as strong as you may be at the end of that first year if you've chosen a different provider, and then you're doing a lot of self-development over a course of time anyway. I know Ella came off mute as well, so I don't know if you've got something to add to that as well, Ella.
I was just going to say, I think it can be quite difficult to find a school to do the teaching, the sort of the Teach First or the schools direct through, unless it's specifically set up for that. I mean, I think the ARC Academy is amazing at all the training that is provided through that and the support that's given for people sort of emerging into their new career. But I think certainly for sort of smaller primary schools, it's quite difficult. You know, we get contacted all the time asking if we could support students going into that kind of course, and we just don't have the capacity for it. So I think you need to really pick and choose, and don't assume that you're going to necessarily be able to find a school that will be able to support you through that year, because it is quite demanding on the school to support you. So I think if you have done your PGCE and you've had, you know, quite a good range of experience usually through that, then, you know, I think it sometimes can be easier then to find a job after that, depending on where you want to be.
That's really helpful. And yeah, as I say, we'll send out a bunch of recommended links for all the panelists after. So we've got a few questions in our Q&A, which Emily from MyTutor has been keeping her eye on as well. I'll just, Emily can reveal herself. And yeah, what questions have we got?
Yeah, so we've had a few people asking about the sort of key skills and key challenges of being a teacher. So it'd be fun if we can all go around and say the number one most important skill for you being a teacher, and also most challenging part of the role. So Hannah, maybe we can start with you.
For me, the most challenging thing is choosing your priorities, because I think I went into school teaching with a very naive, idealistic view of being able to teach all this stuff that I didn't learn at school, and imparting all this knowledge that I would have loved to have, but essentially I have 1 hour a week with my classes, and there's like 34 kids in each of those classes. So I think the hardest thing is kind of the realistic viewpoint of being like, okay, what can I actually do within this? The freedom that you might envisage is less, and I guess sometimes there can be some difficult pastoral stuff as well, which is difficult when there's only a certain, I guess it's the same concept, you can only help people so much, which is difficult for me.
Nice. And what's your best trait that a teacher should have? Best skill?
Best skill? The best skill a teacher can have is being relatable.
Nice. And Ella, what about you? What do you think has been your most important skill and biggest challenge?
I think it's very, very important to be a good communicator in teaching. You need to be able to get your point across and talk to a huge variety of different people, whether that's, you know, young people, children, their parents, your colleagues, Ofsted inspectors, people from the local authority. You know, you do need to kind of be able to get your point across and teach, obviously. I think a challenge is, especially in the world of SEN, I think as soon as you become a SENCO, even if you are very sort of under-experienced, as I felt I was when I first started, everyone looks to you to be the expert in everything. And I think that can be the case as a teacher as well. You know, young people and colleagues and parents, you know, they expect you to know everything. And I think going into the SENCO role, you know, I was suddenly kind of, you get all sorts of questions thrown at you, and you're kind of almost expected to diagnose children left, right and centre, which I still can't do now with lots of experience. So I think a lot of the time it's about managing expectations of children and parents and colleagues and people that you work with, that you don't have a magic wand. That can be probably the biggest challenge of my working week.
Nice. And how about you, Christy? Do you echo those thoughts? What's your top skill, top challenge?
My top skill, I think personally, it's building relationships with your pupils. I think whatever it kind of like underpins my entire practice as a teacher is having like a really strong relationship with my pupils. And by that, like, I don't mean like you have to be like their best friend and, oh my God, like, hi, every time you see them. It's just like being genuinely interested in them and actually caring about them, and they really notice and they really know these things. Like, I think this really comes through, especially with like younger years and A level. They really do love it when they feel like you have a vested interest in them, and they can kind of sense if you're being fake about it. So it's better to just kind of be yourself and like let it come naturally, rather than trying to be something that you're not, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
My biggest challenge personally for me as an NQT, it's genuinely just like, on your PGCE, there's certain things that you can't do because obviously you're still a student yourself. So as soon as you become that NQT, it's almost like you're like, okay, this is your role now. Here's everything it entails. Get to work. And it is a lot more work for you to do. It is very demanding. It's a lot of work. You have to be very organized. That's not to say that it's like not enjoyable or anything. It's just that's something that I think you need to be aware of when going into teaching, that your NQT year is definitely like it's almost like the leap from A level to third year of uni, where it's like a lot of pressure on you and you feel like a bit like you're confused. But I think with the right department, which I actually have, it's not as bad, and it's just, as long as you're supported, I think you'll be fine.
Nice. And what about you, Mark, last but not least?
I think I think equally you need to both be resilient to deal with the sort of things that Christy's talking about, but also think you need a sense of humour, and that includes an ability to laugh at yourself, because you see these students all the time. You will at some point make an idiot out of yourself, and if you take yourself too seriously, students, you know, they won't buy into you, and that buys into what Hannah said about being relatable. And having that sense of humour will actually make you build those relationships far more easily, and they will buy into you. Someone will put in the chat about being worried about behaviour issues, and if you've built that relationship with the students, you don't get half the behaviour issues anyway. And the toughest thing, I think, would be about just balancing everything that you have to do. So everyone's aware that you have to teach, mark and plan, but they don't necessarily tell you that you might have a form group, you might also have a lunch duty, you might be have a meeting or an extracurricular activity after school, and therefore that you may have some days where you are busy every moment for the whole course of that day. So I'd suggest from that, being very, very organised is the best way to get around that, and making sure you know your priorities and when things are due, and making sure you get ahead of the game. I don't think it's wise to be hitting deadlines at the last minute in teaching, because it often means you miss them instead.
Right, good to know. And so this kind of ties into your answer, but one of our questions was, is it easy to find the work-life balance in teaching? Ella, do you want to take that one?
I think at the beginning of your career, it's quite challenging. Certainly during the PGCE year, it's very, very challenging. And then NQT year and sort of onwards in the first couple of years, I think it's really difficult. And certainly we've got an NQT currently who is finding things quite tough, and she wants to be in school all the hours that there are. And, you know, have to force her out the building and say, no, you need to go home and just switch off, because it is hard. There's lots to do. Certainly teaching is not just, you know, being in school from 8:30 till 4 and saying see you later and having lovely 13 weeks of holiday, which is a definite bonus, the holidays. But I think, you know, certainly there is a lot to do. And I think, as Mark said, you know, there will always be other things that are kind of part of your working week that you need to kind of factor in. So yeah, I think, I mean, you know, teachers have a great time and it's a wonderful job. So I wouldn't say, you know, you're working all the time, but it's yeah, there's a lot to do.
Yeah. And then a slightly more practical question, Mark, maybe you're best placed to answer this. You said we don't often see people move from secondary to primary, but if someone gets their qualification in secondary PGCE, could they go to primary if they wanted to?
Theoretically. So from sort of the experience I'm dealing with at the moment, so ARC training, for example, won't take someone on who's already got QTS, so who's already got qualified teacher status, because there'd be no point in them doing the training year in that. However, there is the potential to convert. One of the schools I'm attached to in East London has an English teacher who's come from primary into secondary, and that was, there was maybe a bit of proving subject knowledge, and I imagine the same would be vice versa. So if you're going from secondary into primary, I imagine Ella would be going, well, do you know anything about phonics? Because if you don't, then you're not going to do very well. And it's definitely possible, but you need to check whether providers will take you on because of whether you've got QTS or not.
Cool, thanks for that.
Yeah, I think the thing about sort of the actual kind of, you know, there are things that you would need to know, and schools may not be willing to expend the time and effort in training you in if they didn't need to. But also there's a lot of people out there who, you know, have the experience and are looking for primary school jobs. So I think it can be harder to move from secondary to primary, because if you're up against, you know, people who already have the primary experience, the school is probably going to go for that person. So it's certainly not impossible, but I think it's harder.
Nice. That brings us very neatly on to 6 p.m. So Mariota, I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. Yeah, I just want to say a big thank you, firstly, to everyone who's asked really great questions, and especially to all of our panelists here. It's been so great to hear all of your different experience, expertise, recommendations. And I just really hope that everyone who's come today, that it will give you at least a few pointers in the right direction and a stronger sense of what the best possible next steps in your teaching career will be. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and yeah, have a good evening.